from, cloud to server to Afghanistan. So we've covered a wide range of topics, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper into just different tax and risks and things here. So first question for the panel, centered around phishing attacks. What are some of the best practices that you would advise for organizations to prevent and detect phishing emails or phishing attacks?
Well, I think user awareness is probably where a lot of security begins. Is just, making sure that everyone within an organization has training on how to look at the URLs, look at the email addresses that your emails are coming from, and just have a general awareness. If you don't recognize it, you don't know who it's from, then you need to do some inspection.
No, that's the answer. I think the only thing I would add to that is it's got to be a positive environment, right? So you're gonna have a lot of users that are gonna start reporting things that aren't phishing, and you can't have that negative. You can't say, oh, you can't report those because of it. So just that positive reinforcement and hey, it's a team. I think that's exactly what we need to do.
I've talked a lot today, Tony, but I will throw in a couple of things. Context is really fun to have. If one of the things that we're starting to see now is companies invest in essentially getting a weekly update about what are the threats to their company, right? If I'm in manufacturing, I have a certain type of threat vector. If I'm in, transportation, it's another. And so getting intelligence that's about your company and sharing it to your employees, it takes what Heather and Corey said to a whole nother level. Because now they're it's not just like they're fishing in the dark. They're actually seeing what those targeted attacks are going to be. And social engineering, #1 vector. And so when they go to phish you, they're going to your social media first. They're looking at what you're doing online. And so if you're not locking your accounts down, if you're not making your employees aware of the threats that could face them, having an open Facebook account or an open, even LinkedIn and other things, can really, go a long way to protecting a company.
I know I was at an event last week. We were having this conversation around phishing came up. And I think there was someone in the audience who was very shocked at just the idea of consequences or, I don't say punishment, but just kind of retribution if somebody does start to have attacks. Like, what are your opinions on that? Like, contests are good. You're incentivizing proactive advice, but the remediation of somebody does do something, what advice would you give for that?
Well, I know one thing, a lot of people are going to say they're either pro these phishing campaigns or they're against. Personally, as I started off as an end user, I never really liked them because it was, you got in trouble if you got it wrong, right? But what if you got it right? Never really heard back, right? So there was no positive reinforcement. And as I moved on through the organization, one thing we do here at Common, as people report things like that, we recognize them. We celebrate it, but it's also a story to tell our other employees that are going to come across similar situations. So it's a way to not only recognize the employee, but also communicate that out.
Yeah, I've been in an org that had 3 strikes, you're out. When it came to phishing, and worked for the ex-director of the NSA, so it was a pretty tight ship, right? And I think that that negative reinforcement can just put people on edge, right? And I think that especially when you have people within the organization that are not security professionals, so they're in HR, they're in marketing, they're, whatever their role may be, I think that I think Corey's right. You've got to take a positive approach, because if people don't have that awareness, don't have a background in cybersecurity, it's not going to be as obvious. And I'll tell you, we had a session at our user conference, and there was an attack on a port, and the adversary had actually got into the cameras and was videoing the people in the office building and then emailing them, showing them that they were watching. And so it's scary, right? And so I think we need to address these things, because it often gets targeted from a personal perspective too. So, a lot of people who get taken advantage of Especially, when it's around the holidays or otherwise, it's around banking, or it's always something that kind of pulls at them in particular. So I think it's such a personal thing that we need to look at, how do we educate? It really boils down to education.
It's a great answer. Watching it work in Canada, that's frightening. So jumping ahead to ransomware attacks. So, in the most recent Verizon data breach report, ransomware attacks continue to grow, and there's been an increased volume of attacks towards small to medium-sized businesses. What advice would you give for these organizations and small businesses to stay ahead of ransomware?
Yeah, I hate to have to reiterate it, but a lot of it's awareness. It's really just knowing what's happening. We had an incident a couple of years ago where we were called in to help a local small business, that the CEO clicked on a UPS email because he was expecting a package to arrive, which launched a ransomware attack on his entire network and encrypted his entire business in the span of about 30 minutes. They had hired another IT firm to back everything up. They put a server in and everything. And so when we showed up to help them recover, first thing I said was, "Where's your server at?" And he went, "It's in the closet." We went in there and it was powered off. So that it wasn't backed up. And so one of the things that we've learned through that process and helping those companies is, number one, is he had no idea. He had no idea what he couldn't click on. As a small business owner, you typically have access to everything in your company. And that's a problem too, because, as soon as they got a hold of his account, they crawled all of the shared drives and the accounting systems, the HR systems. And I mean, it froze his business for the greater part of 3 days. So, obviously you have to practice good cyber hygiene. You got to be aware of what's going on, but you also, you have to be knowledgeable of what people are doing, how they're coming after you. And I can say I probably get, I don't know what, Corey helps me out with this stuff, 50 a day of someone trying to click, get me to click on a link. It's crazy. You're under siege all the time.
No, it's a great answer, Nick. I mean, it's one of those things that it's just spreading, and it's not something that you can really get ahead of, because you fix one hole and they're going to find another, and it just takes that one instance, and especially with 68%, breaches starting with factor phishing, right? A lot of this ransomware, that's how it's getting in, and it's not just showing up one day. Things don't just get encrypted. There's a million, thousands of alerts that probably go out, but they get so much noise nowadays. Companies aren't really truly investing in balancing their people and technology as they look through the alerts that they're getting. And, once they go back and forensically analyze the stuff, they say, "Hey, we saw 1,000 indicators of this ransomware that we didn't pick up on." And, after the fact, it's too late. So one thing that they can do is, take more of a proactive approach in the offensive and defensive security leading up to that point. But, at the end of the day, remember that ransomware is going to turn into two things. One, you're down, your systems aren't available. But two, that data, has been exposed. So whether you pay the ransom and you get access back, you still can't guarantee that nobody saw it. So a couple things there to consider.
I think with small businesses, oftentimes it's the owner who is also having to manage the security, or, even if you look at small school districts, my kid's school had a ransomware attack, and the IT person was our photography teacher. So, I mean, these are people who are often, trained in cybersecurity. So I think that trusting in well authenticated partners or managed services for small business for security is always smart, especially if you don't have someone that's dedicated to this part of the practice. So I think it's that piece. And the other thing that I would say is that there are lots of different organizations like the multi-state ISAC. There are all sorts of information types of organizations within regions and states that put out information about what threats look like. And so I would say, having small businesses aware of what some of the resources are. Even the FBI and CISA often provide resources if small businesses are in trouble.
We are very fortunate in St. Louis. We have a great system rep, Chris Cochran here. He's always available. I encourage you to check out and reach out to him. He's got lots of great resources and happy to come and talk. So we are 3 years into COVID, or not or beyond COVID, and we're in the world of remote work, right? The world shut down, everybody went home, and there were lots of risks involved in this idea of remote work. You know, what are some things that a small business or organization could do to help mitigate the risk of somebody working?
That's a great question. You may or may not like my answer, but a lot of companies when COVID first started, small businesses that had to be remote, you know, like we brought up, they don't have a lot of budget to invest in technology. So, you know, they flip a few switches and it's just you know, you bolt the door shut, right? So security just goes to the roof, but then you're also expecting people to remote in. So you put a lot of barriers in place, but you're asking people, okay, now stand outside the wall and throw rocks. Right? And it just didn't work. People were just, it was shutting down businesses. And what's the opposite of that? Okay, we'll turn everything off. Right. So then all of a sudden now you have all these security vulnerabilities that can turn back on. It's a balance. It's don't over secure things. Keep in mind that security is a service. Things have to stay available. The best security practice you can have is something simple. So, you know, just keep things simple and make sure people understand what you're putting in place. You know, be secure, give them a secure way to log in, but also, you know, encourage them to not go around things when they can.
I would just say that, I worked with the Defense Industrial Base during COVID, and there are a lot of small businesses, and we saw a lot of them move to Office 365 and other types of solutions that were managed for them. And so I think that for small businesses, taking a look at what is the best of breed that you can utilize for those systems that majority of your users are working on is a good idea. I think oftentimes it's hard for small businesses to balance what the right mix of security is. So I think there's a few key fundamental things that you really just need to focus on and make sure that you're investing in solutions that are well tried and true.
So I'm gonna go on screen because I have a question what I know the answer to for a while. I always think of like Edward Jones right there. I equate them to the McDonald's of, you know, financial planning. Not that that's a dig, McDonald's is bad, but they're in every corner across the country. So you hit small offices in rural communities or even homes, right? About home. How are these organizations or how can you protect? You have no control over the ISP or the router and the switch and the modem that they're using for that stuff. Which is the main problem. And then I can bring all of my kids' devices to my internet and my Xbox and all the other things. How does an organization protect that and ensure that, you know, there's not bad things getting onto their network?
So what I'll say is, especially in highly regulated industries like the financial industry, which Edward Jones is a part of, they do take a lot of care, especially in all their remote offices, to regularly refresh hardware. So they're investing in a regular cycle of hardware, software, and they're doing as much as they can to control the network and the traffic and the encryption between those remote offices and the headquarters office here in St. Louis. Now, in other instances though, right, you've got, you know, a chain of car dealerships or a chain of, you know, repair shops or whatever, you know, those are different. They don't have the resources that an Edward Jones has, or, you know, a large business like Steeple even has, who has a lot of different offices. So it really depends. And I do think that it aligns to the risk reward ratio, which is with financial services, there's a high risk. And, you know, you're going to get hammered, you're going to lose your reputation if you get hacked. And so there's a lot of money, there's a lot of investment, there's a lot of scrutiny by the federal government on those pieces of industry. Whereas other areas where maybe there's not as high as a potential risk, even though if I owned a business, I would be concerned about it. There's not as much scrutiny, there's not as much regulation. I mean, heck, Heather was talking about pipelines earlier. And up until the attack on the company that owned the pipeline a couple of years ago, there really wasn't any regulation in place to force them to even report that they had been hacked. And so we've come a long way, whether or not you like the politicians that are in charge of our country today. I will say one thing they've done pretty well is they've been focused on increasing investment, increasing policy, increasing regulation to start protecting and putting protections in place of all these different parts and pieces that we should have protected 20 years ago.
I think you've got to segment the network too. I think that, I mean, even at home, I was telling, somebody came over and asked a question. My husband has an affinity for all of the lights, the smart lights. And I just said, you can't have, you know, the guest network touching those devices and then going on and using our personal laptops to connect to our financial. So I think, you know, when you work with your internet service provider, you can ask them to help with the segmentation. You can have different routers. So I would lean on your ISP to help with that.
I think it was Mackenzie's slides earlier, like the EPA stuff, there's such huge implications for small cities across the country that don't have colleges or resources or a two-person shop. Like, how do you suppose the country and cities respond to that stuff? I know there's been substantial investments, $1 billion grant from DHS to help states plan for this stuff, but like, how do we get to a spot where we can actually do that and meet the needs and requirements?
Before we take the hard one.
Yeah.
Sorry, off script, but it's such an interesting part of time that, there was the race for CNNC, right? And then it never dropped. And then there's some CPA stuff. So I'm hoping it's not another one of those, because the critical infrastructure is a huge and important part of our country. So the regulation is important. My concern is the response and how these small towns can actually do that, or small school districts like photography teachers taking care of IT. That's a problem.
That's a great question, Tony. And you look at those same organizations you're describing, and the money that they get from the federal government for physical security, it far exceeds what they get for information technology. But the security in those environments is the same. That's when, the OT meets the IT security. And then, you throw the conundrum in there. Where does cyber lie? Is it in IT? Is it under traditional security? And then you can go down another path. I think the most important thing you can do, again, is just know your risk, right? Because again, whatever the risk threshold is for the organization should dictate what they spend or what they adjust on security. Smaller organization, but they still have a high risk. Well, that money's got to come from somewhere. And if enough of these smaller companies, that have to raise their rates because their cost of goods being sold increases because of security, the government's going to have to step in at some point and say, okay, here we're going to equalize this physical security with IT security. And I think that's pretty much the only path forward there.
We work with the NRSCA, National Rural Electric Co-op Association. I know they're working to pull resources on a national level to create centers that then would support some of these other organizations to be able to do it. So that is all right. So getting back on script, on topics here, insider threats are becoming more and more of a concern for organizations. How can organizations better prepare for insider threats? And I think now when we've had a massive layoffs, right? I think there's probably some risk associated with that.
Yeah, disgruntled employees, employees that, you oftentimes don't cut off their access. I would say that I sold an insider threat solution for a couple of years to Missile Defense Agency and others. And I think that there's so many different ways that this problem can be solved. But somebody had asked me this question before, and I think that baselining of networks and then taking a look at what deviates from normal is probably one of the best ways to combat insider threat. It's, oftentimes those are activities that happen, off hours, printing volumes, all of those things are indicators. But what Missile Defense Agency did is they did a program internal where they had all of these signs that they posted. See something, say something, essentially. So they did a campaign about insider threat. And I think they raise the level of awareness of, what are the behaviors of individuals who might be looking to, harm our organization. So I think, we keep having this theme of awareness, but I think it really does need to be something that's frequent. And I think that oftentimes organizations will do 1-year annual security training. I don't think that's enough. That's my opinion.
So this is kind of a fun question because we just had probably one of the most boneheaded insider threat situations occur in the US Air Force in the last couple of months, where the Ukrainian kind of strategy was leaked out. And really it was leaked as a result of a guy who's trying to impress his friends, right? They had a Discord channel. They were having a lot of conversations about war and war strategy, and he started posting classified documentation to that Discord channel. Subsequently, it was shared outside of that channel and got picked up by Russia and China, yada, yada, yada. That all rolls back to one person losing kind of perspective of what was important to his organization. I will say too, I think, and we'll see how it all plays out, but I think you're going to see the Air Force and Department of Defense probably change the way they allocate access to specific types of intelligence information, and probably do a better job of protecting it. But, there's one thing to say that there's these Edward Snowdens running around and they're going to nefariously plot the downfall of your organization, which I really do think that those are rare circumstances. But what we just learned recently is that there are probably a ton of people, just like this young airman, who made a mistake, put his company, his country at risk. And I think every business has to think about, okay, how do I make sure that people don't lose their perspective? How do they not lose their context? And how do they not make a mistake like this young man did? It's going to jeopardize the rest of his life, unfortunately, and put ourselves, our leadership in the world at risk as a country. So I think when you're thinking insider threat, a lot of it has to do with perception, ensuring your people know what they're looking at. Good.
Good. All right. How long do you want to go?
Maybe two more questions.
So it was open discussion. This is the thing we talk, or throw a question.
Well, maybe we have some questions from the audience.
Yeah.
There we go.
You don't want Chuck getting that every day.
That's how you catch it.
Just a statement. So coming from the cosmetic technology world, I did talk about it, but there's what's called an Access CBS. And Garrison Technologies, if you're not familiar with them, they build what's called an armed SIM range. And it's used heavily in the banking industry and regulated markets where billions of dollars. And so what they've done is they've created fish pools essentially where they have all their access, all their certain like high dollar banking information and everything, and their employees work in an environment. They don't have any access to the internet. They use what Garrison has is they have what's called ARM sandwich. ARM is the processor that's in your cell phone. And so they have this appliance that's an ARM processor, an FPGA, which is a software defined chip, and then another ARM processor. And so what it does is you open a web browser, the web browser connects to the first ARM processor. It sends your keyboard and mouse instructions to the lower processor. That processor is the one that actually uses out to the internet, brings the web page, renders that takes an image off of that screen that ARM processor is generating and sends it through the FPGA back up to the other processor. And so you're actually watching a movie of the video from the lower processor and sending your keyboard and mouse down to it. So what that does is that allows the banking industry to go to Peru or some other African nation who most of those banking sites have now embedded in the banking sites. It can compromise the lower ARM processor, and none of the malware gets sent outside if you do that on the high side. And so they're able to access the highest risk websites, do all their stuff on the internet. And when a user logs off the lower ARM processor, it reboots. And so you get different appliances, like 50 or 100 of these things. So you can say, well, my organization will support X sessions on the internet. Then they don't have to worry about the malware. They just assume that every time anybody goes on the internet, they're going to get compromised. And as soon as they disconnect from that device, I'm going to reboot it to a pristine state. It's not inexpensive. I will say that because there's one there, it's unique technology that's been taken from the UK Ministry of Defense across the commercial world, and the big banks that process billions of dollars and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in clients like that to protect the billions of dollars in so there is a poor man's version of that. It's called IKVM, and so we use them because we're not a bank that moves billions of dollars around. And so we have a VPN connection into a IKVM that actually connects into a computer that's on the internet. And so that's how we get from our trusted development environment to the internet person with the things that we do. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to look at IKVMs that may be more inexpensive solution for remote VDI if you can get them there, you can buy.
That's awesome.
So I was at a conference not that long ago, and the president of WGU came up and ran through a slideshow. And he put headlines from 10 years ago, 7 years ago, 5 years ago, and literally, sound like a 16-year-old girl, literally, all those headlines would be relevant today, right? It was around the tax and workforce, like, and then you couple that with billions of dollars spent on this for the last 10 years. What do we need to do to like change those headlines to actually have an impact on all of these things? What's the red pill you take to solve it?
I'll take a shot. Change takes time. And, I've been with Uncommon 9 years now. And what we were doing when I was a 10-person company versus what we were today as a 200-person company, I've seen a lot of changes like this. I've seen a tidal wave of cybersecurity bachelor's and master's degrees show up here in St. Louis, Washington University, Webster, SIUE, UMSL, everybody investing and getting at the forefront of this threat that we face. I mean, I think, probably going up through technology, there was one cyber guy for every 30 developers. They couldn't keep pace with the stupid code that we were writing on a daily basis. But that equation's changed. I'm seeing more security awareness in the developers' mindsets. We're seeing people come out of college with a cybersecurity mindset. We're seeing businesses look across the aisle and go, you know what? The DoD is probably the best cybersecurity defense force in the world. So let's start bringing retired military folks over to help us build strategies and appoint them as CISO. So, it's unfortunate that, like what you said, headlines from 15, 20 years ago are still showing up. But I believe, given another 5 years, we're going to be in an interesting spot. CISA has really made an impact on this country. They're doing great work, kind of, number one, securing our defense industrial base, securing our daily life stuff, utilities, pipelines, all that stuff is now being secured, or at least they're putting money into that, which is a big deal. So, like I said, change takes time, but I think the decisions we've made, and I think those decisions don't have a specific Democrat or Republican thing around them. I think we all just want to protect our livelihoods. And I think you're going to start really seeing those things shift over the next 5 years. But, I reserve the right to change that opinion depending on, what happens outside of our country. I can't control what Russia and China and all these other folks do.
So I'm gonna step back from my security professional role into my mom role. And I think that educating our kids is super important as early as possible. So my kids spend a lot of time on their iPads, right? And so I was telling Mackenzie, before they download any app, they have to show me what kind of data is shared. If their IP is shared, if there's any identifiable information, they are not allowed to download it. So I think you have to take a look at what we're consuming. You have to make a choice. And I think that, you know, taking that and giving them that gift of understanding why. I mean, my daughter was 8 years old when we implemented this policy. I mean, it's really hard for an 8-year-old to understand what bad guys are doing out there. But I think, you know, if you can put it down on their level and explain to them, you know, come up with a way to kind of talk to that level, we all should be making those types of choices. We also made our 12-year-old daughter take the Cyber Patriot after school program. And she didn't want to do it. She's like, I don't want to be like you and dad. I'm not into software. He said, well, you're going to do at least a year of it, just so you understand what it means, because the jobs of tomorrow are not the same ones we have today. And so just because you want to be a doctor or a nurse doesn't mean that you're not going to have to deal with the cybersecurity of the technology that you're using as a doctor or a nurse. So you need to have a basic understanding how technology works. And I highly encourage you all to get behind that, because you're here for a reason, right? And you can influence not just your kids, you can influence, you know, kids in the schools. Go and talk to the schools and help them understand from a very young age what it means to be secure. It's never too early to start that, in my opinion.
Well, I'll build on that. So Cyber Patriot's a great program. Tony knows a ton about that. It requires us though in industry. You know, these are volunteer programs, people like us that know what we're talking about to a certain degree. They have programs they can provide you, but it's important on us to contribute back to our communities to allow high schools and middle schools to have these Cyber Patriot programs, but they're a great way to get kids kind of spun up very quickly on the threats that they'll face as they get older and get into the workforce. So it's a great mention for sure.
And speak. Go and speak, volunteer. I can't tell you, the kid, I've done a couple of sessions where, you know, we're supporting girls in tech. They get inspired by you. They want to be you. They want to grow up too fast, right? So I just highly encourage you guys, if you've got any desire to help the next generation, go and speak.
COVID has crushed the education system of K-12, right? Teachers are leaving in mass exodus. So the suggestion of volunteering and supporting teachers so it doesn't solely fall on those, and the Cyber Patriot teams that excel generally have a robust state curriculum. North Dakota is the first state in the country that actually requires cybersecurity curriculum for high school students. You know, Missouri has a terrible computer science program. It's awful. So like, you know, I encourage you, not politically connected here, but like go talk to your politicians and like encourage this kind of curriculum and education and access for students. So it does become more prevalent. Anybody have any questions for the panel? I have one more I could ask, but I'll pass it to you guys. If there's anything out there. Everybody's going home.
Yeah, let me wrap it up.
Yeah. One last question, because it feels really weird. I have not heard the word AI today, or the letters AI. So like, it feels strange not to at least talk about ChatGPT and AI. So like, what makes you lose sleep at night about things in AI and all of the great tools? My experience, ChatGPT is awesome. It makes my life 10 times easier. I write better emails. So like, but what are the risks you're seeing?
I mean, they're plentiful, right? But I think one of the main things that we have not been good at as a society is evaluating our data, right? How much is your data worth? And people can't tell you, right? How much is the data you have in a server worth that you're housing, you know, customers' information? Well, you don't know. But you know, the company is going to value risk a lot of times based on laptops and servers. Let me tell you something, you can lose those laptops and servers and they're not going to cost you millions of dollars. You have a data breach and it will. So again, that goes back to the concept of knowing the value of your data. But when it comes to AI, same concept, it's just a warehouse of data. And data is about not only value, but correlation. So a piece of data could have a simple value, but you correlate it with 2 or 3 other, you know, strategic pieces of data. Now you have PI. So now that value is 3, right? So AI is going to be really good at gathering data, But, you know, what happens after that? Well, what we just saw is, you know, they're warehousing this data. Who's protecting it? What are our expectations, you know, for protection of that data? I think that, to me, is the scariest thing that keeps you up at night with AI is where's this data going and who's holding people accountable for keeping it safe?
Well, I think it's not unlike the whole discussion we had around TikTok, right? I think it's where is that information coming and how are we validating it? I believe it has to be something that is a discussion at the highest levels of our government, and I think that there's gotta be some open forums around it. I mean, I watched Steve Wozniak talk about it the other day, and he's totally freaked out about it. Right, so I think that it's something that has to be discussed, it's something that is gonna need some level of regulation so that there's misinformation, right? But we also can't stop progress, so I think it's a balance, it's always a choice. But I really think that there's gotta be open dialogue about risk, and I think that, you know, those of us that are in the industry are gonna have to weigh in heavily.
Well, let's give the panel a round of applause. I just want to give a shout out to Talman and World Affairs Council and T-Rex for hosting it today. We did a phenomenal job. I appreciate all you guys coming out and hanging out with us today. I'm gonna pass it to you for closing remarks.
Yeah, I just want to thank Tony Bryan, you know, Director of Cyber Up, give my hand. So building on that Cyber Patriot theme a little bit ago, you know, we had like what, 2-3 teams? When you spun up Cyber Up in St. Louis now, and then we went up to what, 80, 90, 120?
It was a lot, but
I mean, it was an awesome increase. Tony did a lot of advocating for the St. Louis region and Cyber Patriot. So we went from being a nothing burger to being one of the top competitive cities in the United States. So I mean, Tony's just done tremendous work. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you to the Uncommon team. Couldn't have done without you today. Thank you for everybody coming out. And obviously, thank you for all the speakers that came in today, took time out of their days, woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning to go and get in an airplane and fly here to St. Louis. And so I just really appreciate everybody and look forward to this next year. So, you know, hopefully bigger, badder, and even more informative. So thank you so much. Enjoy the food, and we'll see you next year.